Comparing watch brands to car brands. We've seen this before. It's a topic that has been discussed by a few watch enthusiasts. And of course, like this video even needs a preface, it is a very subjective topic. We all have our own preferences in both categories, and it doesn't mean that one is equal to the other, or that if you own one, you should own the other. The idea behind this approach was to look at where popular car and major Swiss watch brands, with a few German exceptions, met, and just how they could compare, hypothetically, by looking at things like their inspirations, visual aesthetics, histories, price ranges, perception, really trying to be more methodical when approaching how they could pair off. So let's have some fun. Seiko and Nissan. Affordable, reliable, durable. Seiko watches are built to work and have seen years of development, similar to Nissan. The deciding factor was looking at the two brands and comparing what you receive for your money. Now there are many branches to the Seiko name, like the Prospex line for example, and in a similar way we see how Nissan with its higher spec vehicles like their Nismo and Spec V models compete. Grand Seiko on the other hand, with their new focus on creating the hybridized spring drive technology and 9F movements, lines up with makers like Lexus and Tesla. When looking at what Tesla has managed to do with their technology, it feels eerily similar to how Seiko has moved forward with spring drive, incorporating it into some of their top-tier models. Moving to Swiss watches paired with European car manufacturers Tudor and Volkswagen. When we think about modern Swiss brands, few have been able to achieve such a great amount of respect in as short a time as Tudor watches. A sister to the Rolex brand, but now one that has managed to find its own path. Now the histories shared between VW and Tudor are slightly different. Some might have expected Rolex to be paired with a brand like VW. Fair enough. But the deciding factor with this pairing also came down to value for money, dependability and reliability. As we know, Tudor watches are decently priced when compared to so many other names. There is also a great utilitarian aspect that makes Tudor watches all the more appreciated, as watches that can just be worn, enjoyed with little fuss or worry. And we could say the same thing about VWs, accepted as great vehicles that are easy to use, modify, own, and are just so much fun to drive. Rolex and Porsche. Close your eyes and think of Porsche. Odds are you'll think of the ever-present, ever-popular 911. The design of the car that has been around for over 50 years, that is without a doubt an icon. But also a design that the Porsche family aims to incrementally improve, with barely any change to the overall character of the car. What else? There is a reason why these cars are always leading the pack in races, why the Boxer engine never fails. Because of their incremental changes over time, sticking to the core design DNA that made them famous. We won't talk about air-cooled versus water-cooled. The cars are bulletproof. And we could use the same practice as a metaphor. The Rolex name, the Oyster case, the Submariner, GMT, Datejust. Their designs can be traced back to the 50s and, to this day, they still look just as stylish and appealing, all of which can perform without fail. Omega and Audi. Audi has seen many achievements. One of the classic stories was when they entered Group B Rally in the 1980s with their newly developed, now legendary Quattro, and subsequently winning every year until they were banned. Similar to Le Mans, where their hybrid technology paved the way forward, helping them win virtually every year until they decided to leave to focus on other pursuits. The caption "progress through technology" is what we could translate into Omega's design identity as well. A watchmaker that also has seen great success. Their watches being sent into space, landing on the moon, being timekeepers for the Olympics since the 1930s. And one of their core traits, incorporating new approaches like the coaxial escapement and following METAS certification. Their use of materials and movement technology has always been pushed further. Jaeger-LeCoultre and BMW. Not just because the names are both abbreviated, both are famously known for creating engines for other manufacturers. They are arguably the best of them. We've seen the use of BMW engines in all forms of aircraft and virtually every mode of transport. They have since managed to create luxurious automobiles that continually integrate sports technologies into their builds, thanks to the M division. JLC as a brand manages to blend the elegance of dress and sports together with all of their pieces, another family famously known for creating movements for other brands and received the reputation of being the watchmaker's watchmaker. We see that the designs of some of their most famous pieces have endured far longer than common designs of the time. Breguet and Mercedes-Benz. It's as simple as saying, if it wasn't for Carl Benz, we wouldn't have seen the motor carriage as soon as we did. And the same can be said about Breguet, as a watchmaker that created some of the most important components that became instrumental in pocket watch and wristwatch development. And as two separate brands, we could recognize their styling without much thought, which is another small detail. The use of grills and bumpers, along with the classic land, air and sea logo, has remained largely the same for well over a century with Merc. As brands continue to reinvent their styles, Mercedes never strays away from their core styling. Similar to Breguet, a brand that is bold to use the most traditional of approaches that made their pocket watches famous, with quirks like coin edging on their cases, the iconic Breguet-styled hands and numerals. We can't forget the guilloche on their dials either. Famous with a traditional focus. Breitling and Land Rover. The comparison between these two brands, one being a vehicle created solely for off-road use and the other a precision timepiece made for pilots. Built for different purposes, but originally were made to fulfill one category well. We saw the original vehicles sent all over the world, being used by countless military forces, but also becoming a fan favorite for civilians. We saw the Navitimer receive the same reception, being used by military forces and civilians, and it is a watch that nowadays is seen as a classic, especially if we're lucky enough to find vintage pieces or the latest reissues. IWC and Bentley. The IWC name is very high class, with a great tradition and history. It has been known to create watches in many areas for casual wear, military specification, but nowadays they are mostly known for their pilot watches. Similar to Bentleys, who went from steam motorbikes to aeroplane engines and finally automobiles, they share similar beats. They use retro styling but in a more modern way, holding on to elements from the past and tailoring them for modern audiences. Like how the Big Pilot has been modified to fit as an everyday wearing watch, but still adopts the large onion-styled crown, calling back to those traditional pieces, so Bentley still keeps to those aesthetics of their classics from the 1930s. Panerai and Alfa Romeo. The early years for both companies were pivotal, one creating a legendary series of racing cars that outshone its competitors in all events, and the other the first dive watches to ever be made, issued to Italian frogmen as far back as the 30s. Another two families that managed to hold on to their core design DNA when creating their products. It also helps that both brands have Italian heritage. The Panerai divers still remain today as some of the oldest looking industrial pieces, but the charm is in their styling, similar to Alfa, who takes great pride in reminding owners of their past, with callbacks to quirks and design inspirations that move their cars forward. Zenith and Lotus. Two names that found their footing in the later years, but both creating pivotal technologies that saw their competitors fail. Lotus with their iconic Formula One team and ballistic technological powerhouses, and a now successful series of roadgoers. And Zenith producing one of the world's first automatic column wheel chronographs that was adopted by many names through the 70s all the way to the 90s. Both hold a racing pedigree, which also makes the pairing even more exciting. Blancpain and Aston Martin, two brands that seem to be quite misunderstood and overshadowed by other popular names, but they are linked in that way. Aston Martin, established as a racing brand, succeeded in many Grand Prix races and continued, really finding its footing again in the early 2000s. Blancpain, known today as a brand that created one of the first world-renowned dive watches, issuing them to militaries everywhere, has a great status amongst enthusiasts that too creates top-tier movements. And the image of seeing James Bond driving an Aston, wearing a 50 fathoms, is something enticing as well. There is a nice blend of elegance and sporting functionality that goes with both names. Patek Philippe and Ferrari, two pioneers. One that has created some of the finest racing cars in history, the other creating top-tier performing watches that are also extremely innovative. Collectively, the two brands are well known. Both have indelible amounts of history. Both are expensive to own, and expensive to service when something breaks. To this day, both are known as some of the best brands in the world, not only because of their marketing, their care when it comes to creating. More importantly, they are governed by passion, the will to go that extra length to create the correct sounding exhaust, to go the extra length when creating the best sounding minute repeater chime. Passion is what both brands strive for, and what owners ultimately buy them for in the end. Vacheron Constantin and Rolls-Royce. Two names that create products with a focus on elegance. Rolls-Royce with their pioneering engines, now used in virtually every industry, a strong focus on historic inspirations with cars that still look like they resemble automobiles of the 30s and 40s, and a keen attention to detail. We could even say the most attention to detail. Vacheron, a part of the trilogy, is the least recognized of the three, but is also the most underrated. With a strong past, rivaling the likes of Breguet with their innovations, today they still produce watches in all categories, from sports to dress, and manage to create pieces that call back and mirror the originals from years before, but are still just as timeless by the way they present themselves. Audemars Piguet and Lamborghini. So with the foundations of Patek and Ferrari focusing on passion, Vacheron and Rolls focusing on elegance, AP and Lamborghini focus on impact, aggression. Both the car manufacturer and the watchmaker build statements. Their modern designs are commonly linked to products of the 1970s, with jagged lines, aggressive, brutalist styling. At the same time, they use high-performance components and experimental materials with their designs. Top-tier products, top performers on both sides. H. Moser & C. and McLaren. The McLaren F1 set the foundation for McLaren Automotive, and Moser saw a great rebirth with the Endeavour. Both have since evolved their brands. High-end performers in all categories, designed with a unique approach. And at this point in time, both brands are experimenting with many new additions to their line, like McLaren with the Speedtail and Moser with the Streamliner, both calling back to past innovations but adding unique takes on how their designs are handled. A. Lange & Söhne and Bugatti. Now yes, Bugatti has an incredible history. In comparison, Lange has a great past that was cut short because of what happened in the 40s, but the company saw a monumental resurgence with the Lange 1. And we could say the same about how the Veyron arrived and was given center stage. A Lange & Söhne, some believe, and I believe it to be, an epitome brand. It has its own language, pushes innovation in every direction when it comes to simplicity, pure German stylistic choices. It's a brand that isn't as popular as the trinity of pieces yet, but it's getting there. And when all is said and done, you end up wearing a true modern masterpiece, very much like owning the car. F. Pigeon and Pagani. Another two brands that are fairly new to the game, but who have both gone their own way. Pagani has become such a renowned car because they are entirely bespoke. So much attention is put into the smallest of details. And with F. Pigeon, those in the community know that these watches go above and beyond. Unique complications, finishing and engineering by a mere handful of watchmakers. And the result is that the watches share a unifying design language that appears both modern and classical. Built to an entirely individualistic specification, very much like Pagani. Richard Mille and Koenigsegg. Both feel like prototypes, experimental approaches, governed by space-age materials and new technologies. Both share a conceptual image that some might find impossible that they actually work after seeing them in photographs, but both manufacturers aim to approach their products differently, thinking outside of the box. And the common theme that links all of these products together is that they have the air of prototype to them. And that is the selection. Of course, there were many brands that weren't mentioned. Maybe this can be continued in the future. Part 2 focusing on specific cars and watches together, instead of just looking at brands entirely. While working on this write-up, I found that so many automotive companies shared almost identical pasts, and that they were harder to divide compared to watches. Watches, their brands and families, really have been able to establish themselves within a certain niche, some being made for military specifications, others being made for certain events, places, environments. Most of these watches in their families have really made an impact somewhere down the line. With cars, they are built to be driven, Many in this category were sports cars, but some utility vehicles also have their place if we were to look at them more practically. The difficulty is finding out how these vehicles essentially defined their brands. So these comparisons might not have been for everyone. I'm sure many of you feel disgruntled that either your car and watch were paired together, or that they weren't paired together, or that your watch brand and car weren't mentioned at all. Again, this was just for a bit of fun, and I'd really be interested in knowing your thoughts on the subject. What would you pair up, and why? Let's enjoy the discussion.